Chapter 1. Shadows of the Past. Jess sat on the edge of her bed, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting long, creeping shadows across the room. The soft hum of the world outside her window contrasted sharply with the rising turmoil within her chest. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake the persistent sense of unease that had been haunting her for days. There was no reason for it, not yet. Everything seemed normal, too normal. The room around her was a mix of muted colors, reflecting the life of a woman who had found solace in simple routines. A family photo sat crooked on her nightstand, depicting a younger Jess with Tessa, beaming in the sunlight at a park from years ago. The image was a distant memory now. Life had been easier then, uncomplicated. Jess reached for her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media until her thumb froze on a post. Tessa had shared a photo of herself, beaming next to a man. He was older, much older. His face was half-shadowed, eyes too sharp for the broad, casual grin he wore. A sick feeling twisted in Jess's stomach. She couldn't place it at first, but something about the man was wrong. An instinct, a flicker of recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. Her pulse quickened, hands growing cold despite the warmth of the room. She clicked on the photo, enlarging it, studying the details of the man's face. Her breath caught in her throat. The high cheekbones, the curve of his jaw, those eyes, dark, piercing. She had seen that face before. Years ago, memories began clawing at the corners of her mind, pieces of a past she had long buried. Jess forced herself to stand, pacing the room, her movements jittery and restless. She hadn't thought about college in years, not since she had left those dark days behind. But now, in the silence of her bedroom, the past began to unfold like a long-forgotten nightmare. She hadn't remembered him until now, hadn't allowed herself to, but that face, how could she ever forget? In the photo, Eric looked different, older, but the eyes hadn't changed. She remembered those eyes in the dim corners of crowded parties, always watching, always waiting. Jess's skin crawled, the weight of the forgotten memory now pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She moved to the window, pulling the curtains aside and peering out into the night. Tessa was still out with him. Jess imagined them somewhere now, maybe walking together, Eric's hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, just like in the photo. Tessa wouldn't have known. She couldn't. The innocence in her smile in that photo. She was blind to the danger, oblivious to the monster by her side. Jess's mind spiraled further into panic, and she had to grip the windowsill for support. Outside, the night was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, as if the rest of the world didn't feel the storm brewing inside Jess. She closed her eyes, letting the memories flow now, trying to make sense of them. College had been a blur of parties, late-night study sessions, and fleeting relationships. Jess had met many people during those years, some friendly, others less so. But there had been one, Eric, who had stood out for all the wrong reasons. He had never been one of her close friends, more like a shadow on the edges of her social circle. Back then, she had brushed off his attention as harmless, just another guy too eager, too persistent. But there had been nights when Jess would find herself alone, walking back to her dorm after a party, and she would sense someone behind her. She had convinced herself it was nothing, just paranoia. It was college, after all. Late nights and strange encounters were part of the experience. But now, the realization of who that shadow had been, how close he had been, sent shivers down her spine. Back then, nothing had ever happened. He had never spoken to her, never acted on the unsettling way he watched her. But the feeling had stayed with her for years after, that nagging suspicion that something was off, something dangerous. Jess had buried it deep, wanting to move on, to forget. Now, the past had resurfaced, with Tessa at its center. Jess turned back to her phone, staring at the picture of Tessa and Eric. Her daughter's face was so full of life, so unaware of the danger she was walking into. Jess's hands trembled as she lowered the phone, trying to think of what to do, but her mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as memories and fear collided in her head. She couldn't think straight, couldn't focus on a plan. All she knew was that she had to protect Tessa, even if it meant reopening old wounds, revisiting a time in her life she had fought so hard to escape. With shaky hands, Jess turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. She stood still, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. In the quiet of the night, her heartbeat was deafening. The shadows on the walls seemed to creep closer, like a past that could no longer be contained. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a car engine hummed, growing louder. Jess walked back to the window, watching as headlights cut through the darkness. The car slowed, stopping just in front of her house. Jess's breath hitched as she saw Tessa step out of the passenger seat, her laughter muffled by the closed window. The driver remained unseen, but Jess knew who it was. Eric. He was here, right outside her home, as if the years between them had vanished in an instant. Tessa waved as the car pulled away, its taillights fading into the distance. Jess's pulse raced as her daughter turned, walking up the path toward the house. She didn't move from the window, her eyes glued to Tessa's figure until she disappeared into the shadows of the porch. Jess knew then that her past had found her again, creeping into the present, threatening to destroy everything she had tried to protect. There would be no more peace, no more forgetting. The shadows of the past had returned, and this time, they wouldn't let her go so easily. Chapter 2. The Unsettling Glance. Morning crept into Jess's home slowly, casting pale light through the thin curtains. She hadn't slept. Her bed, usually a refuge, had become a prison, trapping her in a constant cycle of fear and intrusive memories. Her body was heavy, but her mind was restless, racing through the events of the night before. Tessa had come home safe, unaware of the terror that had unfurled within Jess, but the sight of Eric, older, more polished, but undeniably him, had rattled Jess to her core. She finally peeled herself out of bed, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. The house was still quiet, the air thick with the leftover tension from the night before. Jess moved through the hallway like a ghost, her movements sluggish and automatic. The framed photos lining the walls blurred in her peripheral vision, though she knew them all by heart. Snapshots of a happier time, when life was simple, when Tessa was a child and Jess could shield her from everything. In the kitchen, the sun had finally risen high enough to bathe the room in a soft, golden light. Jess stood by the sink, staring out the window at the dew-covered grass, the morning mist still hanging low over the yard. She wrapped her fingers around the edge of the counter, grounding herself in the solid, cold surface. It didn't help. The unease was deep, burrowed inside her like a parasite. A distant thud from upstairs, Tessa's footsteps, snapped her out of her trance. She exhaled sharply, blinking as if waking from a dream, and began preparing breakfast. The scent of coffee filled the room, a small comfort in the otherwise unbearable quiet. Tessa came down soon after, her presence like a burst of energy in the room, disrupting the heavy air. She moved with the casual grace of someone young and carefree, and Jess couldn't help but watch her with a mixture of love and dread. Tessa's golden hair caught the morning light, a stark contrast to Jess's darker, disheveled locks. Her daughter had inherited so much of her father's appearance, his easy smile, his bright eyes, features that only seemed to remind Jess how little she could protect her. Tessa's movements were light, effortless, her morning routine quick and unbothered. She didn't notice Jess's watchful gaze, didn't sense the way Jess's hands gripped the mug of coffee too tightly, her knuckles white. Every movement of Tessa's was a reminder that her daughter was slipping away, unknowingly walking closer to the danger Jess had tried to leave behind. After breakfast, Tessa left the house with the same carefree attitude she had the night before, her keys jingling in her hand as she waved absent-mindedly in Jess's direction. Jess stood by the window, her coffee forgotten on the counter, watching her daughter walk down the driveway. The sunlight played tricks with the shadows, making Tessa's figure seem to fade and reappear, like a distant memory trying to resurface. Jess didn't stop watching until Tessa's car turned the corner and vanished from view. The silence of the house pressed down on her, growing heavier with each passing second. She leaned against the sink, feeling the cold, slick porcelain under her palms. Her mind wandered again to the photo. Tessa, smiling next to Eric, his face partially obscured but clear enough to ignite the panic Jess now struggled to contain. Why hadn't she recognized him immediately? It had been years since she had seen him, years since she had allowed herself to think about those days. Back then, Eric had been nothing more than an unsettling figure in the background of her life, a fleeting threat she thought she had escaped. But now, his presence in Tessa's life felt deliberate, malicious. What were the chances? Was it coincidence, or had he sought them out? She needed answers. Jess moved quickly now, urgency overtaking her exhaustion. She grabbed her phone from the kitchen table and scrolled through her contacts. She paused, hesitating at the name of an old friend from college, a woman who had been closer to Eric's social circle back then, someone who might know more about what had happened to him in the years since. Jess's thumb hovered over the call button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. It had been too long, too much time had passed. Instead, she placed the phone down and paced the kitchen, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. Her memories of Eric were fragmented, hazy. There hadn't been a defining moment of terror, no single event that had marked him as dangerous in her mind. But it was the way he had lingered, always in the background, always watching. Jess had never been able to shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, though she had never found out what. She found herself wandering through the house, each room feeling more suffocating than the last. The air seemed to cling to her skin, thick with memories she couldn't escape. She ended up in Tessa's room, standing at the doorway, staring at the space that was so intimately her daughter's. Posters adorned the walls, books and clothes were scattered in the usual teenage chaos, and the bed was unmade, the comforter twisted and bunched from Tessa's restless sleep. Jess moved inside, feeling like an intruder, though this was her own home. She ran her fingers over Tessa's desk, her eyes catching on the smallest details, the lipstick left uncapped, the stack of textbooks that hadn't been touched in weeks, the framed photos of her daughter with friends, laughing and carefree. Jess stopped in front of one photo in particular, her heart sinking. It was a picture of Tessa with Eric, another one she hadn't seen before. They were standing close together, too close. His hand rested on her shoulder, the same predatory gaze Jess remembered from years ago hidden behind a smile that barely touched his eyes. A cold dread settled in Jess's chest. This wasn't just coincidence. Eric wasn't here by chance. She turned sharply, leaving the room and heading back downstairs, her breath coming faster now. She couldn't let this go on. Whatever Eric wanted, whatever his intentions were, she couldn't allow him to drag Tessa into his twisted world. Back in the kitchen, Jess stood at the sink again, staring out into the backyard. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long shadows over the grass. For a moment, she imagined what it would be like to go back, to return to a time when Tessa was small, when her biggest worry was scraped knees and forgotten homework. But those days were gone. Tessa was 18 now, making her own choices, and Jess couldn't control her. But she could protect her. Jess felt a determination rising within her, hardening her resolve. She couldn't allow her daughter to fall into the same trap she had barely escaped all those years ago. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Eric wasn't just a shadow from her past anymore. He was real, he was here, and he was a threat. As the day wore on, the house grew darker, the sunlight fading as the hours passed. Jess barely noticed the time slipping away. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the maze of fear and memories. Outside, the sky darkened, the soft glow of evening settling over the neighborhood. Jess stood by the window again, waiting for Tessa to return. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the empty street, the shadows lengthening as night crept closer. Every passing car made her pulse quicken. Every flicker of movement outside sent a chill down her spine. When Tessa finally pulled into the driveway, Jess exhaled, though her relief was short-lived. She saw the other car behind her, Eric's car. He was back. Jess's hands clenched into fists as she watched Eric step out of the car, his movements slow, deliberate. Tessa laughed at something he did, oblivious to the danger that walked beside her. Jess's stomach churned with a sickening dread. She stood in the shadow of the kitchen, hidden from view, watching them through the window. The air felt too thick to breathe, her pulse pounding in her ears. Eric's gaze drifted toward the house, and for a moment, Jess could have sworn their eyes met, even through the distance and the glass. His look was familiar, too familiar. A glance that carried the weight of years, of secrets, of things unspoken. And then, just as quickly, he turned away, smiling at Tessa as they walked together up the driveway. The past had come knocking, and Jess knew she could no longer keep the door closed. Chapter 3: Tessa's New Flame. The sun was sinking beneath the horizon, casting the sky in a mix of gold and pink, but to Jess, the colors seemed muted. She watched from her living room window as Tessa and Eric stood on the front porch. The weight of what she had learned, what she had remembered, made her feel as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Her breathing was shallow, her heart a steady thud in her chest as she observed their interaction. Tessa was smiling, her eyes lit up with the innocent joy of someone who hadn't yet seen the world for what it could be: dangerous, deceptive. Her laughter echoed faintly through the walls, muffled but sharp in Jess's ears, cutting through the thick silence that surrounded her. Eric stood close to her, leaning casually against the porch railing, his posture relaxed. His smile was practiced, charming even, but to Jess, it was a mask, hiding something far darker beneath. Jess's fingers dug into the fabric of the armchair, her knuckles whitening with the pressure. She had tried to tell herself, time and again, that it couldn't be the same Eric from all those years ago. She had wanted to believe it was just her mind playing tricks, that the past wasn't circling back into her life in such a cruel way. But the truth had become impossible to ignore. Eric's face, though older, had been seared into her memory, and now he was here, his presence no longer a distant, unsettling recollection but a real and immediate threat. Jess's stomach churned with unease as she stood and moved closer to the window, her face partially hidden by the curtains. She watched them closely, though she knew she had no real power from this vantage point. Her daughter's laughter stung, a reminder of how little Tessa knew. She didn't see the danger. She didn't know the man standing next to her had a history with Jess that could end everything they had built. As the sky deepened into a darker shade of blue, Eric's hand moved subtly, resting on Tessa's arm. It was a small gesture, one that might have seemed affectionate to anyone else, but to Jess, it was invasive. She gritted her teeth, her mind spinning. Eric hadn't just appeared in her life by accident. No, he had found Tessa for a reason. Jess couldn't shake the thought that he had come back for her, through her daughter. Her skin crawled with the knowledge, but she didn't know how to act. Not yet. Tessa finally waved goodbye to Eric, and he lingered just long enough to make Jess's pulse quicken before turning away and heading down the driveway. His figure disappeared into the twilight, his car's headlights slicing through the darkness as he drove off. Jess stayed at the window, watching the space he had occupied, her body taut with a combination of fear and fury. Once Eric was gone, Tessa opened the front door and stepped inside, her presence light and carefree. She moved through the house without a care in the world, humming softly to herself as she headed toward the stairs. Jess heard her daughter's footsteps ascend, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a reminder of everything she was about to lose if she didn't act soon. Alone again, Jess found herself drifting through the rooms of the house, her mind replaying everything she could remember about Eric. Her memories were disjointed, fragments of parties and long-forgotten nights in crowded college dorms. Back then, she hadn't paid him much attention, but now every interaction felt significant. Every glance, every moment of him watching her from the shadows seemed to take on a more sinister weight. She ended up in the kitchen, the silence pressing in on her. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, its rhythm mocking her. She stared at the empty space where Tessa and Eric had stood just a short while ago, the air still heavy with their presence. The memory of Eric's hand on her daughter's arm burned into her thoughts, igniting a deep, primal fear. She knew she had to do something. Anything to stop this before it spiraled out of control. But how? How could she explain this to Tessa without sounding paranoid, without making her daughter think she was losing her mind? The Eric from Jess's past was a shadow, a threat that had never fully materialized. But now, he was real, flesh and bone, standing in her house, touching her daughter. Jess felt the cold metal of the kitchen sink under her hands, and she squeezed the edge, trying to ground herself. Her gaze drifted to the back door, beyond which the backyard stretched into the darkening night. The garden was overgrown, wild compared to the rest of the meticulously kept neighborhood. Jess had always loved it that way, a small rebellion against the suburban perfection around them. Now, though, the overgrown plants and looming trees felt more like a trap, a place where someone could hide, watching without being seen. She stepped outside, feeling the cool air against her skin. The night was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the faint hum of distant traffic. Jess scanned the yard, her eyes flitting to the darker corners where the shadows seemed to cling stubbornly to the earth. She could feel his presence, even though he wasn't there. The sense that Eric was always nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike, was suffocating. She walked to the edge of the yard, where the fence stood tall and weathered. The wood was rough under her fingers, splintering in places. Beyond the fence was an empty lot, the remnants of an old house still visible in the overgrown weeds and crumbling stone. Jess had rarely paid attention to it before, but now, in the heavy stillness of the night, it seemed ominous, like a forgotten relic of something dark and long buried. Jess took a step back, her heart beating fast. She turned away from the fence and walked quickly back toward the house, her pulse racing. Inside, the house was warm, the lights casting a soft glow on the walls, but the tension didn't leave her. She knew this wasn't just her imagination running wild. Eric's presence wasn't a coincidence, and she couldn't afford to ignore the warning signs. The night stretched on, the house growing quieter as Tessa settled into her room upstairs. Jess stayed awake, pacing the house, checking the locks, glancing out the windows. Each shadow seemed to grow longer, each creak of the floorboards louder. She couldn't sleep, not with the thought of Eric lurking in the back of her mind, a predator waiting to strike. As midnight approached, Jess found herself sitting at the kitchen table, the house bathed in an eerie silence. The ticking of the clock was the only sound, its rhythm now a steady reminder of time slipping away, of her chances to protect Tessa diminishing with every passing second. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment, but the image of Eric's face burned behind her eyelids. She could still see his sharp eyes, the way they had locked onto her so many years ago. He had been watching her then, and now he was watching her daughter. The thought filled her with a cold dread. Jess's eyes snapped open, and she rose from the table, her body tense. She couldn't sit idle any longer. She had to find out more about him, about what he had been doing all these years, and why he had come back into their lives now. There was no escaping the truth. Eric had returned for a reason, and whatever that reason was, Jess had to figure it out before it was too late. She grabbed her phone from the counter and hesitated. She could feel the weight of the decision she was about to make. Calling the police, talking to Tessa, it wasn't enough. Eric had to be dealt with directly, exposed for the danger he truly was. Jess wasn't the frightened college girl anymore. She was a mother, and her instincts were sharper than ever. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled up a search engine on her phone. She typed in Eric's name, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. There had to be something, some piece of information that would confirm her suspicions. She scrolled through the results, her heart pounding as she sifted through articles, social media profiles, and records. Her breath hitched when she found it. An old news report, buried deep in the archives, surfaced on the screen. A photo of a younger Eric stared back at her, the same eyes, the same sharp features. The headline was enough to make Jess's blood run cold. Local man questioned an unsolved disappearance of college student. Jess's hands tightened around the phone as she read the article, her pulse thudding loudly in her ears. The details were vague. Eric had been connected to the disappearance of a woman during their college years, but nothing had ever been proven. The case had gone cold. No body was ever found. But the implications were clear. Eric wasn't just a shadow from her past. He was dangerous. He had been then, and he was now. Jess's mind raced as she pieced it all together. The way he had watched her back then, the strange encounters, the feeling that something terrible had almost happened but never did. And now he had found his way back into her life, through Tessa. Her grip on the phone tightened. She stood up, a surge of adrenaline rushing through her. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, every second feeling like a countdown. Jess knew one thing for sure. Eric wasn't finished. He had come back to finish what he had started years ago. And this time, Jess wouldn't let him win. Chapter 4. The Past, Unburied. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, but Jess was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table. Her eyes were bloodshot, her body numb from a sleepless night spent trapped in her thoughts. The article she had found the night before played on an endless loop in her mind, each line burning itself deeper into her memory. Unsolved disappearance. Eric questioned. No charges filed. Jess's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee mug, the warmth doing little to quell the chill inside her. It wasn't just the terror of what she had learned. It was the undeniable fact that Eric had returned to finish whatever dark intentions had been left unresolved. And now, Tessa was his focus. The thought of her daughter, so trusting, so unaware, twisted Jess's insides. Tessa had no idea of the danger she was in, and even if Jess told her everything, would she believe her? How could she convince her daughter that the charming, attentive man she had begun seeing was a monster hiding in plain sight? No words could explain the depth of Jess's fear, not without sounding like a paranoid mother grasping at shadows. The house was quiet around her, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Jess glanced at the clock. Tessa was still asleep upstairs, her usual weekend routine of staying up late and sleeping in well underway. Jess was grateful for the silence, for the solitude. She needed time to think, to plan. She needed to know more about Eric's past, about the woman who had disappeared during their college years. Pushing away from the table, Jess grabbed her phone again, her fingers moving with determination. The article she had found last night had been brief, but perhaps there were more details somewhere deeper in the archives. She scrolled through various sources, clicking link after link, searching for anything that could tell her more about Eric, more about what had happened to that missing girl. Hours passed as she sifted through old news clippings, police reports, and blog posts from amateur investigators. The woman's name was Rebecca Kane, a senior at the time of her disappearance, just weeks away from graduation. She had been popular on campus, bright, sociable, with a promising future. And then, one night, she vanished without a trace. Jess found herself drawn to a photograph of Rebecca. She studied it carefully, her eyes tracing the contours of the woman's face. There was something unsettling about the picture, something that tugged at Jess's memory. Rebecca looked familiar, too familiar, and then it hit her. She had seen this face before, not just in the news articles but in her own past. Rebecca had been in one of Jess's classes back in college. They hadn't been friends, but Jess remembered her. The bright smile, the easy laughter. It was a jarring realization that Jess had known the missing woman all along. Another ghost from her past resurrected. She leaned back in her chair, her pulse racing. The connection felt too close now, too personal. How had she forgotten? How had she erased Rebecca from her mind until now? But then again, those years after college had been a blur of survival, moving, finding work, raising Tessa. It had been easier to push those memories into the recesses of her mind, to let them dissolve into the background noise of a life rebuilt. But Eric had never gone away. He had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to re-enter her life. The more Jess read, the clearer it became that the police had never seriously considered Eric as a suspect. There had been rumors about his relationship with Rebecca, nothing official, just whispers among their peers. Some had claimed they had seen them together in the weeks before her disappearance, but Eric had never been charged. He had been questioned, sure, but his alibi had held up. and there had been no physical evidence to tie him to her disappearance. The case had gone cold, eventually fading into obscurity like so many unsolved tragedies. Jess's fingers tightened around her phone as she stared at Eric's name in the articles. There was nothing concrete, no damning evidence that could be brought to light. But Jess knew the truth. She had felt it back then. The way Eric had watched her from a distance, the way his presence had made her uneasy. It had all been subtle, just enough to make her second-guess her instincts, but now it all made sense. He had been playing a game, testing boundaries, seeing how much control he could exert without being caught. And now he was doing the same with Tessa. Jess stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. She paced the kitchen, her mind racing. What could she do? Confronting Eric outright wasn't an option. Not yet. She needed more information, more proof that could expose him. But time was running out. Every day that passed, Tessa grew closer to him, her trust in him deepening. Jess couldn't wait for the perfect moment to act. She had to do something now. Her thoughts turned to Rebecca again, to the missing woman whose fate was still a mystery. There had to be someone who remembered her, someone who might have more insight into what had happened back then. Jess needed to talk to someone from college, someone who had known Eric and Rebecca better than she had. There was one name that surfaced in her memory, a woman named Claire, who had been part of the same social circle as Eric and Rebecca. Jess hadn't spoken to Claire in years, but if anyone knew more about what had happened back then, it would be her. Jess found Claire's number buried deep in her contacts, a relic from another lifetime. She stared at the name for a moment, her thumb hovering over the call button. It had been years since they'd last spoken, but this wasn't about rekindling old friendships. This was about finding the truth. With a deep breath, Jess pressed the button, her heart pounding in her chest as the phone rang. She let it ring several times before hanging up, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Claire didn't answer, and Jess wasn't surprised. It had been too long. People moved on, left the past behind, just like she had tried to. But the past had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. Jess pocketed her phone and leaned against the counter, staring out the window. The yard, once again bathed in daylight, felt less foreboding in the morning sun. But even the brightness of the day couldn't ease the tension that had settled deep in her bones. Eric was a threat, and she couldn't let him slip through her fingers like he had with Rebecca. The hours crawled by in agonizing slowness. Jess found herself aimlessly drifting from room to room, her thoughts like a tide pulling her deeper into the memories of her college years. She didn't want to go back to that time, to the days when Eric had first entered her life, but it seemed inevitable now. The man had found his way back into her orbit, and ignoring it would only place Tessa in greater danger. In the afternoon, Jess ventured into the attic, a place she hadn't visited in years. Dust clung to the old wooden beams, and the stale air was thick with the scent of forgotten things. She rummaged through boxes, searching for anything that might help her piece together her past. Old photo albums, papers, and letters passed through her hands as she sifted through the remnants of her younger years. The act felt invasive, like she was rifling through the ghost of who she used to be, but it was necessary. At the bottom of one box, she found a stack of old college yearbooks. They were faded, their covers worn from years of neglect. Jess pulled them out, setting them down on the floor as she flipped through the pages, her fingers brushing against the glossy images of students smiling brightly at the camera. Some faces were familiar, others forgotten. But one page, one group photo, made her freeze. There they were, Eric, Rebecca, Claire, and a few other students Jess vaguely remembered. The picture was candid, taken at some party, laughter frozen in time. Eric stood near the back, his arm draped casually over Rebecca's shoulder. She was laughing, her eyes bright with the carefree joy of youth. But Eric, his expression was different. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. It was more of a smirk, as if he were in on a secret no one else knew. Jess's stomach twisted as she stared at the image. She could see it now, what she hadn't seen back then. Eric had been dangerous even then, hiding in plain sight, blending into the background of their lives. She traced her finger over the photo, her mind racing. This was the man who had charmed her daughter, who had wormed his way into their lives with such ease. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. Jess stood up, clutching the yearbook tightly in her hands. She had no proof, nothing concrete to show Tessa or the authorities. But she had memories, fragments of a past that were becoming clearer with each passing day. As the afternoon light faded, Jess knew that this was just the beginning. Eric had resurfaced for a reason, and she was determined to find out why. She wasn't going to let him disappear again, not like he had after Rebecca. Her fingers tightened around the spine of the yearbook as she headed back downstairs. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, Jess was ready to confront the past that had come back to haunt her. Chapter 5. A presence at the edge of vision. The days that followed were a blur of tension and watchfulness. Jess moved through them like a woman holding her breath, her nerves fraying with every passing hour. She felt like a predator and prey all at once, caught in a game she didn't fully understand. Eric's presence, even when he wasn't physically there, felt suffocating, as if he lingered in every shadow, watching her through unseen eyes. The knowledge of his dark history clung to her like a stain, impossible to wash away. Jess had expected Tessa to notice her distraction, to ask questions about her sudden quietness, her restless energy, but Tessa seemed to be living in a bubble of bliss, oblivious to her mother's growing anxiety. She spent more and more time with Eric, her visits with him becoming more frequent, her laughter more carefree. Jess watched from the background, a spectator to a nightmare unfolding in real time. She could see how Eric was weaving his web around her daughter, how his charm had ensnared her just as it had so many others before. Jess couldn't stand it. Each time Tessa left the house to meet him, Jess felt a rising panic, a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. She didn't want to be the overbearing mother, didn't want to alienate Tessa by making her feel smothered or untrusted, but the fear gnawed at her. How could she explain to Tessa that the man she adored, the man who made her laugh and blush, was a predator? Jess could see it so clearly, the darkness beneath Eric's polished exterior, but Tessa was blind to it, shielded by the innocence of youth. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Jess could hardly look at Tessa without feeling a surge of dread. She kept her thoughts locked tightly within, not wanting to tip her hand too soon. She was waiting for the right moment, though she had no idea when that moment might come. Her instincts screamed at her to act, to do something before it was too late, but she was paralyzed by the enormity of the situation. One wrong move, and she could lose Tessa's trust forever. And worse, if she pushed too hard, Tessa might fall deeper into Eric's arms, seeking refuge in the very place Jess needed to pull her from. It was during one of these suffocating afternoons that Jess decided to follow them. She had no plan, no strategy, just a desperate need to know more. To see what they did, where they went. She had to understand how deep Eric's hold on her daughter had become. Tessa had left the house with a quick wave, her face glowing with excitement as she bounded toward the car where Eric was waiting. Jess stood at the window, heart pounding, watching them drive away. The moment the taillights disappeared down the street, Jess grabbed her keys and followed. The sky was overcast, a heavy blanket of gray that pressed down on the city. Jess trailed Eric's car from a distance, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had never done something like this before, never felt the need to spy on her own daughter. But the stakes had never been this high. She kept her car far enough back so that she wouldn't be noticed, though every time they stopped at a light or turned down a side street, she felt a stab of panic that Eric might see her. She couldn't let him know she was onto him. Not yet. The streets grew quieter as they drove out of town, leaving behind the familiar suburban sprawl for roads that wound through patches of woodland and isolated stretches of farmland. Jess felt her pulse quicken. Where were they going? Why would Eric take Tessa out here, so far from anyone else? The further they drove, the more desolate the landscape became. The trees growing thicker on either side of the road, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the light. After nearly an hour, Eric's car slowed, turning down a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the forest. Jess hesitated for a moment, fear tightening its grip on her. This wasn't just a casual drive. This was something else, something darker. She knew she should turn back, but she couldn't. She had to know. She followed them, the crunch of gravel under her tires the only sound in the stillness. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers overhead, blocking out what little daylight remained. The road was rough, winding deeper into the woods, and Jess's stomach churned with unease. She could feel it. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Up ahead, Eric's car finally came to a stop at the end of the road, near a clearing that opened into a dilapidated cabin. The structure was old, its wooden beams weathered and sagging, half hidden by overgrown weeds and vines. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like something from a different time. Jess parked her car behind a cluster of trees, far enough back that she wouldn't be seen, but close enough to keep an eye on them. She watched as Eric and Tessa stepped out of the car, laughing together, as if they had just arrived at some secret, magical spot. Tessa's face was glowing with excitement, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. To her, this probably seemed like an adventure, a thrilling escape from the routine of daily life. But to Jess, it was a place of isolation, a place where no one would hear you scream. Jess crouched low behind the trees, her heart hammering in her chest as she observed them from a distance. Eric took Tessa's hand, leading her toward the cabin. They disappeared inside, the door creaking on its rusty hinges as it swung shut behind them. The forest around Jess was silent, the air thick with the weight of unspoken dread. Minutes passed, each one stretching out into what felt like an eternity. Jess's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, her imagination conjuring images of what might be happening inside that cabin. She couldn't sit here any longer, waiting. She had to know what was going on. Steeling herself, she crept closer, her movements slow and deliberate, her footsteps barely audible on the soft forest floor. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she crouched low, hiding behind a large tree. From this vantage point, she could see the front of the cabin, its windows dark and cracked. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, but the silence pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. There was nothing, no laughter, no voices, no movement. Jess's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as she waited. Her thoughts were scattered, bouncing between the past and the present, between the fear she felt now and the fear she had felt all those years ago when Eric had first entered her life. Back then, she had brushed it off, ignored the unease he caused. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Just as she was about to move closer, a sound caught her attention, a soft rustling from behind the cabin. Jess froze, her body tensing. She listened intently, her pulse thundering in her ears. The noise came again, closer this time. A subtle, deliberate movement, like someone creeping through the underbrush. Slowly, carefully, Jess edged around the clearing, moving toward the back of the cabin. Her heart was in her throat now, every sense on high alert. As she drew nearer, she could make out a figure moving through the trees, tall, slender, with sharp movements that seemed almost predatory. It was Eric. He wasn't inside the cabin with Tessa. He was out here, circling the perimeter, watching. Jess's blood turned to ice as she crouched lower, pressing herself against the rough bark of a tree. What was he doing? Why had he left Tessa alone inside? A sickening realization settled over her. He was stalking her, watching her without her knowing. He had brought Tessa here not just to charm her, but to isolate her, to control the environment. This was his game, and Jess had walked right into it. She could see him now, moving between the trees, his eyes scanning the forest like a hunter searching for prey. His movements were calculated, deliberate. He didn't know she was here, not yet, but he was searching for something, or someone. Jess's breathing was shallow, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. She couldn't let him see her. Not now. She wasn't ready for a confrontation, not without a plan, not without proof. She needed to get Tessa out of here, but how? If she made a noise, if she moved too quickly, Eric would know. And then it would be over. She stayed perfectly still, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear deeper into the woods, his figure blending with the shadows. When she was certain he was far enough away, Jess made her move. She crept around the side of the cabin, her footsteps barely making a sound as she approached the front door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her pulse racing. She had no idea what she would find on the other side. Her mind spun with possibilities. Tessa might be completely unaware of the danger. Or worse, she could be in the middle of whatever trap Eric had laid for her. Jess had no choice but to push forward. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and slipped inside. The cabin was dark, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The interior was bare, the furniture long since abandoned, covered in dust and cobwebs. Jess's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she searched for any sign of Tessa. Her heart raced faster when she spotted her daughter near the far wall, her back to Jess, standing before what looked like an old, faded mural painted on the wooden boards. Tessa seemed entranced by it, her hands gently tracing the outlines of the faded figures, completely unaware of the danger she was in. Jess's breath caught in her throat, but before she could move, a sound from outside made her blood run cold. A single footstep, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside the door. Eric was coming back. Chapter 6. Trapped in the cage. The cabin's air was thick, suffocating. Jess could feel the weight of time pressing down on her, as if the rotting walls had absorbed years of dread and despair, trapping it within. The musty scent of decay filled her lungs, but she barely noticed it. Her entire focus was on the steady crunch of footsteps growing louder outside the door, accompanied by the soft rustle of leaves and twigs breaking underfoot. Eric was coming back. Jess's mind raced, her breath hitching in her throat as she watched Tessa, still standing with her back to the door, completely oblivious to the looming threat. There was no way to warn her, no way to pull her out of whatever trance the old mural seemed to have put her in. The faded, ghostly figures painted on the wall looked almost alive in the dim light, their indistinct faces warped with age and decay. The sight sent a shiver down Jess's spine, but she couldn't dwell on it. She had only seconds to act. Panic seized her, but it sharpened her instincts. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a hiding place, an escape, anything that could keep them safe from what was about to come. The cabin was sparse, the furniture skeletal and worn down by time, offering no real protection. Her gaze fell on a narrow closet door in the corner, half concealed by a stack of splintered wooden crates. It wasn't much, but it was their only option. Jess moved swiftly, crossing the room in 2 quick strides. Her hands were shaking as she reached for Tessa's arm, gently but firmly pulling her away from the mural. Tessa's body tensed in surprise, but she didn't resist. Her wide eyes met Jess's for a brief second, confusion clouding her face, but Jess didn't stop to explain. She tugged her daughter toward the closet, her movements silent but urgent, pushing Tessa inside just as the doorknob at the front of the cabin began to turn. The closet was cramped and dark, its air stale with the scent of mildew and disuse. Jess could feel Tessa's rapid breathing beside her, their bodies pressed together in the tight space, but there was no room for comfort. They had to stay hidden. Jess pulled the closet door shut, leaving it open just a sliver so she could see what was happening outside. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound almost deafening in the silence that followed. The cabin door creaked open, its rusted hinges protesting loudly as Eric stepped inside. His silhouette was a dark shadow against the fading light from outside, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire room with a presence that was more menacing than physical. He stood in the doorway for a moment, motionless, as if he were listening to the cabin itself, waiting for it to reveal its secrets. Jess held her breath, willing herself to be still, to be invisible. Tessa trembled beside her, but Jess pressed a reassuring hand against her arm, silently begging her to remain calm. They couldn't afford a single sound, not a whisper, not a breath out of place. Eric had been hunting them without knowing it. Now he was close enough to touch. Eric's footsteps echoed through the cabin as he crossed the room, his boots crunching on the dirt and debris that littered the floor. He moved slowly, methodically, as though he were searching for something. His eyes scanned the room with an unsettling intensity, taking in the mural on the wall, the rotting furniture, the thick layer of dust that had settled over everything. But his movements weren't casual. There was something predatory in the way he prowled around the space, like a wolf circling its prey. Jess watched through the sliver of the closet door, her heart racing with every step Eric took. He moved closer to the mural, his gaze lingering on it for a long moment, as if he too were entranced by the faded figures. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, his body rigid and still, staring at the wall with an expression Jess couldn't quite read. It was almost as if he were waiting for something, listening to a sound only he could hear. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until finally, Eric moved again. He turned away from the mural and walked toward the far side of the cabin, his eyes narrowing as they swept over the empty space. Jess could feel the tension mounting with every passing second. She knew it wouldn't take much for him to sense something was wrong, to realize that he wasn't alone. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the closet door, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do if he found them. She had no weapon, no plan, nothing but raw instinct and the fierce determination to protect her daughter at any cost. If it came to a fight, she wasn't sure she would survive it, but she would make sure Tessa did. Eric stopped in the middle of the room, his back to the closet, and for a moment, Jess thought he was going to leave. He stood there, staring at the floor, his posture stiff, his shoulders tense. But then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward the closet. Jess's blood ran cold. She froze, every muscle in her body locking up as she met his gaze through the crack in the door. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and for a brief second, Jess thought he had seen her, that he knew she was there. But then his gaze shifted, moving past the closet, sweeping over the rest of the room as though he were still searching for something just out of reach. Jess exhaled softly, relief washing over her, but it was short-lived. Eric's movements became sharper, more purposeful, as if something had set him on edge. He circled the room again, his steps quicker this time, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. It was only a matter of time before he found them. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from outside, the sound of something heavy falling against the ground. Eric stopped, his body going rigid, his head snapping toward the door. Jess's heart leaped into her throat. What had caused the noise? Was someone else out there, or had something fallen on its own? Without a word, Eric crossed the room in long strides, pushing the door open with enough force to send it slamming against the wall. He disappeared outside, his footsteps fading into the distance as he moved toward the source of the noise. Jess didn't hesitate. The moment he was out of sight, she sprang into action. She shoved the closet door open, pulling Tessa out with her. There was no time to think, no time to second-guess their next move. They had to get out of the cabin before Eric returned. Jess led the way, keeping low as they slipped through the door and into the fading light of the evening. The forest around them was still, the trees casting long, dark shadows across the ground. Jess could hear Eric moving somewhere deeper in the woods, his footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. She knew they had only moments before he realized they were gone. She grabbed Tessa's hand and sprinted toward the car, her feet pounding against the dirt road as they ran. The sound of their footsteps seemed deafening in the quiet forest, but Jess didn't care. They had to move quickly. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Eric barreling through the trees after them, but there was no sign of him yet. When they reached the car, Jess fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she tried to unlock the door. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Finally, she got the door open and pushed Tessa inside. She jumped into the driver's seat, her fingers trembling as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Jess slammed her foot on the gas. The tires spun in the dirt for a brief moment before catching traction, sending the car lurching forward down the narrow road. Jess gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. As they sped away from the cabin, the trees whipping past them in a blur, Jess felt a surge of relief. They were getting away. They had escaped, but that relief was fleeting. As the car raced down the dirt road, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that Eric was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for his next move. The sun had dipped lower on the horizon, casting the world in hues of deep orange and crimson, like blood spilled across the sky. Jess's heart still raced, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The quiet of the forest seemed to stretch on forever, the road winding ahead of them like a never-ending escape route, but Jess knew better. Eric wouldn't give up so easily. He had found them once before. He would find them again, and when he did, there would be no escape. Chapter 7. Shadows in the Rear View. The road twisted beneath Jess's tires, the dirt and gravel kicking up in small clouds as she pushed the car harder, faster. The trees on either side of the narrow path became little more than a blur of black and green as they hurtled away from the cabin, deeper into the forest, then out toward the empty countryside. Jess's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles aching from the strain, but she couldn't loosen her grip. Not yet. The sun had all but disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the sky stained with the dying embers of daylight. The orange and red glow cast long, eerie shadows across the landscape, making everything feel sharper, more sinister. Jess's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, her breath catching every time she thought she saw movement in the distance. But each time, it was only the swaying trees, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. Beside her, Tessa sat rigid in the passenger seat, her face pale and her eyes wide, as if she hadn't fully processed what had just happened. She had been silent ever since they escaped the cabin, her hands clenched in her lap, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. Jess could feel the tension radiating from her daughter, could sense the questions and terror swirling inside her. But there was no time to stop, no time to explain. Not here, not now. The forest seemed endless, its shadowy limbs stretching far beyond the reach of the headlights. Jess had never felt so isolated, so cut off from the world. The familiar suburban streets and comforting hum of daily life were miles behind them, lost to the wild, uncaring wilderness. Every bend in the road, every flicker of movement just beyond the trees felt like a trap waiting to spring. Like Eric could be lurking around the next turn, ready to block their escape. She didn't dare slow down. As they sped down the desolate road, Jess couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they weren't alone, that somewhere in the dark, Eric was still following them, biding his time. She had seen the look in his eyes back at the cabin, the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had been hunting for years. He wasn't the type to give up easily. He had found them once, and now that he knew they were running, Jess had no doubt that he would follow. The car bounced over a deep pothole, and Jess's heart lurched in her chest. She shot a glance at the gas gauge, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck as she saw the needle hovering dangerously close to empty. How had she not noticed? They had been driving for what felt like hours, trying to put as much distance between themselves and Eric as possible, but she had no idea where they were, no sense of how far they still had to go. The empty forest seemed to stretch on forever. She needed to find somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't the endless, suffocating woods. A town, a gas station, even a small diner. Anything where they could stop and catch their breath. But the road ahead was empty, and the creeping darkness offered no hints of civilization. Jess's pulse quickened. She couldn't afford to run out of gas here. Not in the middle of nowhere. Not when Eric was out there, somewhere, waiting for his chance to catch up. Jess's eyes flicked back to the rearview mirror again, searching for headlights, for any sign that they were being followed. But there was nothing behind them, just the same shadowy path that seemed to stretch into oblivion. Still, her instinct screamed that they weren't safe. She could feel it, the weight of Eric's presence, like he was hovering just out of sight, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the minutes ticked by, the forest began to thin, the trees growing sparser, giving way to open fields and wide stretches of barren land. Jess breathed a small sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The empty landscape felt even more exposed, more vulnerable. Without the cover of the trees, they were out in the open, with nowhere to hide. Jess pressed harder on the gas, willing the car to go faster, to get them to safety. Suddenly, the road forked, splitting into two narrow paths. Jess's heart leaped into her throat. She had no idea which direction to take. The left path seemed to lead further into the wilderness, the thick trees swallowing the road in darkness. The right path was more open, leading toward what appeared to be an old, dilapidated barn in the distance, its roof sagging and its wooden walls weathered by time. Neither option felt safe, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. Without thinking, Jess veered to the right, the car's tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel as they made the sharp turn. She kept her foot on the gas, speeding toward the barn, her eyes scanning the surrounding fields for any sign of movement. The barn loomed larger as they approached, its silhouette dark and imposing against the fading twilight. Jess wasn't sure what she expected to find there. Shelter, maybe, or at the very least, a place to hide until she could figure out their next move. As they drew closer, Jess slowed the car, her stomach churning with unease. The barn looked abandoned, its windows shattered and its doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Weeds and overgrown grass choked the ground around it, and the entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. But there was something about it that felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for them, as if it had always been part of their story. Jess pulled the car to a stop a few yards away from the barn, her hands shaking as she killed the engine. The sudden silence felt deafening after the roar of the car, and for a moment, Jess sat frozen in the driver's seat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The barn stood before them like a monolith, silent and still, but Jess could feel the unease radiating from it, the sense that they were not alone. Tessa stirred beside her, her fingers curling around the edge of her seat. Jess could see the fear etched on her daughter's face, the confusion and dread that mirrored her own. But there was no time to stop, no time to explain. Jess knew they couldn't stay in the car, not if Eric was out there, somewhere, hunting them. They needed to hide. Jess stepped out of the car, her legs shaking as they met the ground. The evening air was cold, the wind biting against her skin as she moved toward the barn. The door creaked on its rusted hinges as she pulled it open, the sound echoing in the empty field around them. Inside, the barn was just as dilapidated as it appeared from the outside. Empty stalls, broken beams, and a thick layer of dust that coated everything. The air smelled of old wood and decay, but it was shelter. For now, it was enough. She waved Tessa over, her movements hurried but careful, and together they stepped into the barn, closing the door behind them as quietly as they could. Jess's heart raced as she scanned the interior, searching for a place to hide. Toward the back of the barn, near a cluster of old wooden crates and forgotten farming equipment, there was a small crawl space beneath the floorboards, just large enough for the two of them. Without wasting any time, Jess pulled up the loose boards, revealing the dark, cramped space below. She motioned for Tessa to climb in, and once her daughter was safely hidden, Jess followed, pulling the boards back into place above them. The space was tight, the air thick and stale, but it was safe, at least for the moment. Jess pressed her back against the cold earth, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Above them, the barn creaked and groaned, the wind howling through the broken windows and cracked beams. Jess strained her ears, listening for any sound of Eric's approach, for the telltale crunch of footsteps in the grass outside. But there was only the wind, whipping through the empty fields, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. For what felt like an eternity, Jess lay there in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. Every second that passed felt like an hour, every creak of the barn a reminder that they were still vulnerable, still at the mercy of whatever was lurking out there in the night. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the weight of exhaustion dragging her down, but she couldn't let herself relax. Not yet. Then, faintly, she heard it, the sound of footsteps. Jess's breath caught in her throat, her body tensing as the footsteps grew louder, closer. She pressed herself deeper into the crawl space, her hand gripping Tessa's arm as they lay in silence. The footsteps stopped just outside the barn, and Jess's heart thundered in her chest. She could hear the faint rustle of movement, the sound of someone, or something, pacing back and forth just beyond the door. The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Jess's pulse raced, her muscles locked in place as she waited, listening, praying that whoever, or whatever, was out there would pass them by. But the footsteps didn't fade away. Instead, they grew louder again, the sound of the barn door creaking open sending a wave of terror crashing over her. Eric was here. Chapter 8, Eyes in the Dark. The barn door creaked open, a slow, agonizing sound that reverberated through the hollow space like the tolling of a funeral bell. Jess's heart thundered in her chest, drowning out every other sound. She squeezed Tessa's arm tightly, willing her daughter to remain silent, to stay still. The oppressive darkness of the crawl space felt suffocating, but there was no room for fear. They needed to endure. Jess held her breath, her ears straining to catch every nuance of the world above. Eric stepped inside, the heavy thud of his boots echoing through the barn. She could see the silhouette of his frame silhouetted against the dim light filtering in from the doorway, his movements slow and deliberate. He paused for a moment, seemingly scanning the barn, and Jess's stomach twisted in knots as she realized he was searching for them. The barn felt ancient, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay, but it was still better than the vulnerability of the open field outside. Jess could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, making her claustrophobic as she lay there, holding Tessa close. The shadows seemed alive, wrapping around them, cocooning them in a silence that felt charged with danger. Eric moved deeper into the barn, his footfalls echoing on the wooden floor. He seemed to be assessing the space, checking each corner with meticulous precision. Jess clenched her jaw, her nails digging into Tessa's skin as she fought the urge to pull her daughter closer, to shield her from the nightmare unfolding just inches away. Moments stretched into what felt like hours as Eric continued his search, his presence an oppressive weight that filled the barn. Jess could see him moving just beyond the edge of their hiding place, his shadow shifting as he crouched near the old crates. Each creak of wood and rustle of straw seemed amplified in the suffocating silence, making her acutely aware of the risk they were taking. With every passing second, the tension grew thicker. Jess's heart raced, the fear bubbling in her chest, threatening to spill over into panic. What would happen if he found them? Would he hurt them? The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she fought to keep her breathing steady, to keep Tessa calm. Eric stood up abruptly, and Jess's breath hitched as she felt the rush of air as he moved past them, heading toward the back of the barn. The shadows danced around him, flickering in the dim light, casting long, grotesque shapes on the walls. It was as if the barn itself were alive, responding to the threat that had invaded its stillness. Jess's eyes were fixed on Eric's silhouette, watching as he moved further away. She could almost make out the features of his face, the dark eyes that seemed to glint with malice. He was searching for something, anything that would lead him to them. Suddenly, he stopped. Jess felt her blood run cold as he turned, his gaze piercing through the dim light, searching for signs of life in the shadows. Jess's breath quickened, and she pressed herself deeper into the earth, trying to will herself to become part of the darkness. For a long moment, the barn fell silent. Jess could feel the heat radiating from Tessa's body, her daughter trembling beside her. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the weight of Eric's presence felt suffocating. It was a moment of suspended terror, a breath held in the air, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, Eric turned on his heel and strode toward the door, the creak of the barn floorboards echoing ominously in the silence. Jess's heart sank as he reached for the door, the handle rattling slightly in his grip. She couldn't bear the thought of him leaving, of him knowing they were there and simply choosing to wait. As the door swung closed behind him, the heavy silence returned, but it felt even more oppressive, the darkness closing in around them. Jess and Tessa remained frozen, their hearts racing in unison, the echoes of Eric's presence lingering like a shadow in the corners of the barn. Minutes passed like hours, each tick of time stretching the tension taut as a bowstring. Jess remained alert, listening for the faintest sound that would indicate Eric's return. Tessa shifted beside her, her breathing shallow, and Jess felt a surge of protectiveness wash over her. They had to stay together, no matter what. But then, from outside the barn, she heard a rustle, faint but distinct. It was a sound that didn't belong, something out of place in the quiet. Jess's heart leaped again, the adrenaline surging through her veins as she felt the urge to peek outside, to see if Eric was really gone. She cautiously lifted her head, peering through the gap between the boards. The dim light from the setting sun barely illuminated the interior, but she could see the outline of the door just a few feet away. The world outside was shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, gnarled shadows across the ground. Jess's heart pounded louder in her ears as she strained to listen. The rustling grew louder, and her instinct screamed at her to duck back down, to hide deeper in the cramped space. She couldn't risk it, not now, not when they were so close to being caught. but the fear of the unknown, of what might be lurking outside, gnawed at her. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open again. Jess's breath caught in her throat, and she felt Tessa tense beside her, her little body vibrating with anxiety. Eric stepped inside, but this time, he wasn't alone. Another figure emerged from the shadows behind him, a tall, lean man with a face that was partially obscured by the darkness. Jess felt a rush of dread as she recognized the newcomer's features. They were hauntingly familiar, an echo from her past. The man's eyes glinted in the dim light, and the smirk on his face sent a chill down her spine. He looked just like someone from her memories, a memory she had fought hard to bury. As they entered the barn, Eric moved further in, his demeanor more relaxed, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The two of them shared a look, a silent understanding passing between them. Jess's heart raced as she strained to listen, trying to decipher their intentions, trying to piece together what this meant for her and Tessa. The two men began to walk deeper into the barn, and Jess felt a wave of panic wash over her. She couldn't let them find her, couldn't let them discover their hiding place. She pulled Tessa closer, whispering reassurance in her mind, even though she knew there were no words for the horror of their situation. Eric and the man paused in the center of the barn, their silhouettes illuminated by the sliver of light filtering through the doorway. They spoke in low, conspiratorial tones, their voices barely audible over the rustle of the wind outside. Jess couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation and something more sinister. Tessa's breath quickened, her small form trembling against Jess as they lay hidden in the crawl space. Jess felt a surge of protective instinct, a fierce determination to keep her daughter safe no matter the cost. Suddenly, the man turned, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the barn. Jess's breath caught in her throat as his gaze swept dangerously close to their hiding place. She pressed herself against Tessa, willing them both to be invisible, to be one with the shadows. But the man's expression shifted, a look of recognition dawning in his eyes. Jess could see the faint glint of something sharp in his hand, an old knife, its blade gleaming ominously in the dim light. "Check over there," Eric said, gesturing toward the far side of the barn, his voice low and steady. "They can't have gone far." The man nodded, a predatory grin spreading across his face as he moved toward the back, heading directly for where Jess and Tessa were hidden. Jess's heart raced, a primal fear coursing through her veins. As the man approached, Jess felt her breath quicken, her instinct screaming at her to move, to do something. She couldn't let him find them, couldn't let him get any closer. In that moment, time slowed, the world around her fading as she focused solely on the threat inching ever closer. With a sudden burst of determination, Jess pulled Tessa into her arms, ready to fight for their lives if necessary. The knife glinted in the darkness, a deadly promise of what was to come. They were trapped in the darkness, but Jess would not let fear claim them. She would protect her daughter at all costs. The man paused, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the shadows, searching for the source of the fear that hung heavy in the air. Jess felt her heart pounding, each beat echoing like a war drum in her ears. There was no way out, no place to hide, and the darkness felt like it was closing in around them. But Jess wouldn't back down. In that moment, she felt the fire of a mother's love igniting within her, fierce and unyielding. They might be trapped, but they were not done fighting. Not yet. Chapter 9. The Tipping Point. The man's shadow loomed closer, his silhouette stark against the feeble light spilling through the cracks of the barn. Jess's heart raced, the primal instinct to protect her daughter igniting a fierce determination within her. The air was thick with tension as she tightened her grip on Tessa, who lay curled against her, eyes wide with fear. In that dim crawl space, time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on as the man drew nearer, his knife glinting ominously in the half-light. Jess could see the subtle movement of his breath, the way his chest rose and fell as he scanned the darkness for any sign of life. He was methodical, purposeful, and that made him all the more dangerous. The barn creaked ominously around them, a reminder of the world outside. But inside, Jess felt a different kind of heat, a rising tide of fury and maternal instinct that pushed her to take action. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed a plan. But her mind raced through possibilities, each one more futile than the last. Just as the man paused again, his gaze lingering near the crates, Jess felt a surge of adrenaline. She knew they had to move, had to make a choice. She exchanged a glance with Tessa, her daughter's eyes reflecting the same mix of terror and determination. The bond between them felt electric, a silent promise that they would fight together, no matter what. The man resumed his search, shifting his weight as he approached the cluster of old barrels stacked against the wall. Jess felt the pressure in her chest rise, a choking sensation that threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't let him find them, couldn't let him discover their hiding place. With a sudden burst of resolve, Jess began to inch backward, trying to shift their position silently, hoping to find a better vantage point or a potential escape route. Tessa mirrored her movements, her breath hitching as they crawled deeper into the darkened space. Just then, a loud crash rang out as one of the barrels toppled over, sending wooden staves clattering across the barn floor. The noise reverberated through the air, drowning out the silence and causing Jess's heart to drop. The man whipped around, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the source of the disturbance. Fear surged through Jess, a cold wave washing over her as she realized they had been discovered. She felt Tessa's body stiffen beside her, both of them paralyzed by the sudden realization that they were no longer safe. The man moved toward the noise, knife in hand, the glint of the blade catching the fading light. Jess's instincts kicked in. There was no time to hesitate. She needed to act, to create a distraction, to buy them even a moment to escape. With a swift motion, Jess reached for an old, rotting piece of wood lying in the corner of the crawl space. It felt heavy in her hands, but she knew it could serve as a weapon. Tessa's eyes widened as she saw what her mother was doing, the understanding between them deepening even in this moment of chaos. Jess took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared to make a noise, anything to draw the man's attention away from their hiding spot. In one swift motion, she threw the piece of wood toward the far side of the barn, watching it crash against a pile of empty crates. The sound echoed through the barn like thunder, and she felt a rush of adrenaline as the man turned sharply, heading straight toward the source of the noise. Jess took the opportunity to pull Tessa up and out of the crawl space, guiding her as they quietly crawled toward the far end of the barn. The darkness swallowed them as they moved, hiding them from sight, and Jess could feel the pounding of her heart reverberating in her ears. As they reached the back of the barn, Jess scanned the dimly lit space for a potential exit. The walls were lined with old, dusty farming tools and broken furniture, a stark reminder of the barn's forgotten past. But amidst the debris, she spotted a window, a narrow opening, its glass long shattered, leading out into the wild night. With urgency, Jess motioned for Tessa to follow her to the window. They crouched low, heartbeats pounding in sync as they approached. Outside, the moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the field with an eerie glow. They could see the path leading away from the barn, a narrow trail into the woods beyond. Freedom was so close, but first, they had to make it out undetected. Jess carefully hoisted herself up to the window, glancing back to ensure the man hadn't returned. The barn was momentarily quiet, but she could still hear the faint sounds of movement. Every second felt like an eternity, and the pressure of time weighed heavily on her. "Go!" she whispered silently in her mind, urging Tessa to follow her lead. Tessa followed suit, her small frame barely fitting through the narrow opening. Jess's heart raced as she helped her daughter through, the sound of footsteps returning in the distance, closer this time. They were running out of time. With one last glance at the barn's shadowy interior, Jess scrambled through the window, landing on the cool grass outside. The night air enveloped her, the fresh scent of earth and leaves filling her lungs. She took a moment to orient herself, scanning the dark landscape for any signs of danger. Tessa landed beside her, her eyes wide and anxious as she looked up at her mother. Jess offered a reassuring nod, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Stay close," Jess mouthed silently, the words hanging unspoken between them. They had to keep moving. Together, they slipped into the shadows, darting across the open space toward the tree line that loomed in the distance. Jess kept her movements low and swift, her instincts guiding them as they weaved through the underbrush. Every sound felt amplified in the stillness of the night. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the faint creaking of branches overhead. Jess's heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears as they reached the trees, their trunks rising like sentinels in the darkness. Once beneath the canopy, the world transformed around them. The darkness became a cloak, hiding them from sight as they moved deeper into the woods. The air was cooler here, tinged with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Jess could feel the weight of the trees pressing in, their branches intertwining above like the fingers of 1,000 ghosts. They continued forward, the path beneath their feet uneven and treacherous. Jess could feel the urgency driving her, a primal instinct pushing her to run, to escape the nightmare that had invaded their lives. Tessa kept pace beside her, her small frame moving with the determination of a warrior, fueled by the fierce bond they shared. But even in the darkness, Jess knew they weren't safe yet. The woods felt alive, the shadows dancing at the edges of her vision, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see Eric emerging from the shadows. But there was only darkness behind them, deep and impenetrable. The trees thinned out, revealing a small clearing bathed in moonlight. It felt like a sanctuary, a moment of reprieve in the midst of their flight. Jess hesitated for a moment, scanning the perimeter of the clearing for signs of danger. She could hear her heart thundering in her chest, a reminder of the fear that had pursued them so relentlessly. Where do we go now? Tessa's anxious eyes searched Jess's face, a question without words. Jess crouched low, pulling Tessa close. They needed a plan, a way to find help or to secure their safety. She glanced toward the horizon, where the faint glow of distant lights flickered beyond the treetops. The lights of a town, perhaps a place filled with people, where they could find shelter and safety. But they couldn't just wander blindly into the night. They had to be smart, to stay hidden until they were sure it was safe. Jess looked back at the woods behind them, the path they had traveled now obscured by shadows. Eric could be anywhere, and the thought sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through her veins. In the clearing, Jess scanned the surroundings, her mind racing through their options. The moon illuminated a cluster of trees to the right, casting a long shadow over the ground. It felt like a hiding spot, a place where they could regroup, catch their breath, and plan their next move. With a firm grip on Tessa's hand, Jess led her toward the trees, ducking behind the thick trunks as they disappeared into the foliage. The shadows enveloped them, creating a cocoon of safety amidst the chaos. Jess crouched low, her breath coming in steady bursts as she surveyed the area. From their hiding spot, they could see the path leading back to the barn, and the distant lights flickering in the horizon promised hope. But the fear remained, a constant weight pressing down on them, a reminder of the danger lurking in the dark. In that moment of uncertainty, Jess knew one thing for sure. They would not let fear dictate their fate. No matter what happened next, she would protect Tessa, and together they would fight for their survival. With that thought anchoring her, she steeled herself for what lay ahead, ready to face whatever darkness awaited them. Chapter 10. Confrontation. The moon hung high in the sky, its silvery light spilling into the clearing like a benediction. Jess crouched low behind the thick trunks of the trees, her heart still racing from their narrow escape. She glanced over at Tessa, who was pressed tightly against her, their bodies hidden among the shadows. The weight of their recent ordeal hung heavy in the air, the silence around them filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of night creatures. Jess's mind raced, replaying the events that had brought them to this point. Every heartbeat felt like a reminder of the danger they had narrowly avoided, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Eric was out there, still searching for them, still a threat to their safety. She felt the cool breeze on her skin, the scent of pine and earth grounding her, but it couldn't dispel the gnawing anxiety in her chest. They needed to move, to find a way to safety before the darkness closed in again. But where would they go? The flickering lights in the distance beckoned like a siren's call, promising refuge, yet the path to get there felt fraught with peril. In the clearing, Jess took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could feel Tessa's small hand gripping hers tightly, their bond unspoken yet palpable in the air. The determination in her daughter's eyes mirrored her own. They were in this together. With resolve, Jess began to plan their next move. They would have to traverse the clearing carefully, ensuring they remained out of sight from the barn and any potential threats lurking in the shadows. The distance to the light seemed daunting, but it was a risk they had to take. Jess waited for a moment, listening intently for any sounds that might indicate Eric's presence. The quiet of the night felt deafening, and she strained to hear anything that might betray his approach. Every crackle of a twig underfoot, every whisper of wind through the leaves sent her heart racing. Finally, Jess made the decision. With a gentle squeeze of Tessa's hand, she nodded, signaling for them to move. They slipped out from behind the trees, stepping cautiously into the clearing, where the moonlight washed over them, illuminating their path. As they moved, Jess kept her senses sharp, scanning the darkness around them for any sign of danger. Each step felt like a journey into the unknown, the ground beneath their feet uneven, but her determination propelled her forward. She led Tessa through the clearing, moving swiftly yet quietly, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The lights in the distance flickered like stars, each one a beacon of hope. Jess felt a renewed surge of adrenaline as they drew closer, the desire to reach safety overpowering her fears. She could almost taste freedom, the thought fueling her resolve. But just as they approached the edge of the clearing, a sound broke through the night. A heavy footfall, unmistakable and close. Jess froze, her heart dropping into her stomach as she turned to look back toward the barn. There, emerging from the shadows, was Eric, his figure looming larger than life, the knife glinting menacingly in his grip. A chill ran down Jess's spine, and she felt Tessa stiffen beside her, their eyes locking in a shared moment of terror. There was no hiding now. They had been found. Eric stood there, a predatory gleam in his eyes as he scanned the clearing, searching for them. Jess's breath quickened, and a surge of instinct kicked in. She couldn't let him take them back. They had to stand their ground. With a firm grip on Tessa's hand, Jess pushed forward, stepping into the open. The moonlight cast a stark glow over them, revealing their presence fully to Eric. She felt a rush of fear, but alongside it, a fierce defiance ignited within her. They wouldn't run anymore. They would confront this nightmare head-on. Eric's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features as he laid eyes on them. The moment hung in the air, electric and charged, the world narrowing down to just the three of them. Jess felt the adrenaline pumping through her veins, a battle cry rising silently within her. Eric took a step forward, the knife glinting in the moonlight, his eyes dark with intent. Jess tightened her grip on Tessa, ready to shield her daughter from whatever came next. She could feel the weight of her past bearing down on her, the memories of fear and trauma mingling with the protective instinct that coursed through her. The tension crackled like electricity in the air, and Jess took a deep breath, grounding herself in the moment. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. She wouldn't allow Eric to control their fate any longer. With a sudden movement, Jess stepped forward, putting herself between Eric and Tessa, a fierce barrier of love and determination. She stared him down, the anger and pain of the past bubbling to the surface, mixing with the fierce desire to protect her daughter. Eric's gaze flickered between Jess and Tessa, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. He took another step closer, the knife poised in his hand, but Jess stood her ground, unyielding. The weight of her memories threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down, focusing instead on the present, on Tessa, on their shared strength. Suddenly, the air shifted, the tension snapping like a taut wire. Jess felt the surge of adrenaline propel her forward, a fierce roar rising silently within her. She had faced her demons before, and she would do it again. For Tessa, she would fight. With a swift movement, Jess lunged toward Eric, aiming to knock the knife from his grip. He was taken by surprise, stumbling back slightly as she collided with him. The knife clattered to the ground, its metallic sound echoing through the clearing as it skidded away from them. In that split second, Jess saw the fear flash in Eric's eyes, the realization that he was no longer in control. It ignited something primal within her, a surge of power that propelled her forward. She pushed him back, feeling the strength of her determination amplifying with each movement. Tessa watched, her eyes wide but resolute, the bond between mother and daughter shining through the chaos. Jess could feel her daughter's spirit alongside her, lending her strength as she fought back against the darkness that threatened to engulf them. As Eric stumbled, Jess seized the moment, kicking the knife further away, ensuring it was out of reach. The confrontation felt surreal, each movement infused with a desperation to reclaim their lives, to push back against the shadows of the past. The struggle continued, the two locked in a dance of survival, Jess channeling every ounce of her will into the fight. She was fueled by the memories of her past, the pain she had endured, and the love she had for Tessa. Eric fought back, but the confidence that once radiated from him began to fade as Jess pressed on, refusing to relent. She could see the fear and frustration in his eyes, a reflection of her own strength, and it emboldened her further. In a final, desperate move, Jess managed to shove Eric away from her, sending him crashing into a nearby tree. He stumbled, trying to regain his footing, but the fear that had once defined him now consumed him. He turned and fled into the darkness, the echo of his retreat mingling with the rustling of leaves as he disappeared from view. Jess stood there, breathless, heart pounding in her chest as the weight of the moment settled around her. She turned back to Tessa, who stood wide-eyed yet unwavering, their bond stronger than ever in the face of adversity. In the quiet aftermath, Jess felt a wave of relief wash over her, the realization that they had reclaimed their power, that they had faced their fears and emerged victorious. They were still standing, still together, and that was all that mattered. Tessa rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around Jess, the embrace a silent promise that they would always protect one another. The night felt different now, the oppressive weight of fear lifting as they stood together in the clearing, bathed in moonlight. In that moment, Jess knew they had escaped the darkness, but the journey wasn't over. There would still be scars to heal, memories to confront, but for now, they had triumphed over the shadow that threatened to engulf them. Together, hand in hand, Jess and Tessa turned toward the distant lights, their path illuminated by hope and resilience. They would forge ahead into the unknown, ready to embrace whatever came next, ready to rewrite their story in the light.